do you mean?
Fill me in.
When you nod your head yes, but
Yeah, I know what this is.
Fill me
when
in.
you don't want me to move, when you tell me to go, what do you mean?
I was checking this girl next door when her parents went out. Your phone say, hey boy, come on right around. So I knock at the door, he was standing with a bottle of red wine, ready to pour, dressed in long black satin, legs to the floor. So I went in and we sat down, started kissing, caressing, told me about jacuzzi, sounded interesting. So we jumped right in, all calls diverted to answer phone. Please leave a message after the tone. I mean, me and her parents were kinda cool, but they were the fine line between me and you. We were just doing things and people in love do. Parents trying to find out what we were up to. Saying, why were you creeping round late last night? Why could I see two shadows moving in your bedroom light? Now you're dressed in black. When I left you were dressed in white. Can you feel me? Calls diverted to answer phone. Red wine bottle, half the contents gone. Midnight return, jacuzzi turned on. Can you feel me?
Hi there, this is Dr. Julie Albright. Welcome to class. I introduced myself to you last week, and it was great to see all your comments and responses and get to know you guys better. I will look forward to your comments during the coming weeks together. So we're going to start out looking at what is an intimate relationship? Why are we looking at this in the first place? And the things we want to think about are the fact that a lot of students have their own ideas about what constitutes a relationship. I mean, what do you think of when you think of a relationship? You know, you might automatically go to something romantic, but that's not necessarily the case. There's all different kinds of relationships, and we might ask ourselves and think about, what does a relationship mean? So kind of start thinking about some different types of relationships, and we'll chat about that in our discussion this week. But let's take a look at our first slide and think about maybe the different ingredients within a relationship that we want to think about. The first crucial ingredient is the idea of interdependence. That is, that it's bi-directional. Have you ever been in a relationship? I know I have, with people who you give and you do things for them, you call them, you ask them out or whatever type thing, and you don't feel like it's coming back. It's kind of a one-way relationship where the other person is taking and they're not really giving. So that would be called a unidirectional relationship. And the crucial thing for ongoing positive relationships is that they be bi-directional. A one-way relationship eventually fizzles out. It just can't be sustained. So that's one crucial ingredient. So when you think about the kinds of relationships that we might have, think about this notion of the direction of the relationship, that you want it to be bi-directional. Bi meaning two, directional, two directions. The second aspects of close relationships. Now think about the difference between an acquaintance and someone that you consider a friend or a good friend or even a best friend. What's the difference between those two? Well, one of the things that you could think of right away is the idea of time. You don't consider someone you just met a best friend or a close friend or something like that. Why is that? Well, there's a lot of reasons, but one of the things to think about is the idea that it takes time to build relationships. It takes an investment of time, and people have different time frames in terms of thinking about when they feel comfortable opening up, developing intimacy, and when they feel comfortable trusting you. So other people may be on different time frames, internal time frames than you are. So the idea of being patient with those people if they're not tracking at the same speed that you are. Maybe you make friends faster, you trust faster, or maybe you make friends slower and you open up slower, trust people more slowly than others. So that idea that we might be on different time frames is important to close relationships. Good close relationships take time. The second thing you want to think about is the idea that with close friends, these relationships extend across situations. In other words, you don't just see a close friend in one situation. You're going to see them at different places and things like that. And, at parties, at weddings, you might go out together, you might work together. It could be all kinds of different things. But the idea that most close relationships, you will see this person over an extended period of time and extended across a variety of situations. And think about that person that you might see in one situation. To contrast that, someone perhaps that works at the local Starbucks, you might see that familiar barista, or someone that checks you out at the market, the checker, or someone at the Circle K that you go in and get something. You see their face, you know them, they know you. But that idea that you don't spend enough significant amount of time with them to consider them a close friend, and you don't spend a variety of different situations with that person. So the idea of being a personal relationship as opposed to an impersonal relationship. Impersonal, again, you might go in the post office and see that same person working at the desk when you're mailing something, but it doesn't mean that you're a friend with that person. So that's really the key. And the other idea is it an intimate relationship? Is it a romantic relationship? Is the idea of the expectation of sexual intimacy. Again, this can vary. One person might see the person as just a friend, when the other one sees it as more of a sexual possibility. So, let's think about that, and we'll talk about that more later. But as you think about the kinds of relationships that you have, think about these various components, that it be bidirectional, that the relationship extends over time and extends across situations, that the relationship is personal rather than impersonal, and that there may or may not be this expectation of sexual intimacy. You can have an intimate or a close relationship and it not be sexual. So those are also two different things. So kind of think about each of those components going forward. Next, let's take a look at this figure that I have here. And this is the idea of an interpersonal intimate relationship. So let's take a look at this slide for a moment. I'll give you a moment to just sort of soak it in.
Jacuzzi turned on, can you feel me? Whenever the coast was clear and she'd ask me to come out, I'd say, hey girl, come right around. So she knocked to the door, I was standing with the keys in my hand to the 4x4, jumped in my ride, tripping and nobody saw.
So this chart is a kind of a funnel of relationships. So at the top, the whitest part of the funnel, you can see that it's an interdependent relationship, or a relationship in which the behavior of each participant affects the other one. Interdependence is the defining characteristic of any social relationship. So the idea that there's an interconnectedness, it's a two-way street, it's not just one person. The second layer of the funnel down is that it's a personal relationship. An interdependent relationship is one in which the partners consider each other special and unique. Think about the idea of a real good friend of yours or a family member that thinks you're special or unique. Why is that? What is it about you that they see that maybe others don't? There was a wonderful quote once I said to my best friend recently. I said, friends remind you of who you are. And that's because they know you and they know what's special and unique about you. And sometimes if you're out in the world with people that don't appreciate those special qualities of yourself, your friends can come around and remind you. And that's one of the wonderful qualities of having good friends. The next layer down on this funnel idea is that you have a close relationship. This is a person where the partners have a strong and frequent influence on each other across a variety of activities. So, do you have friends that you see sometimes, you go around with them? This idea that you might see them, but you might not see them for a couple of months. You're still friends, but when you get back in touch, you pick up the conversation sort of where you left off. This idea that one can have a number of friends that you enjoy their company, but they're not an integral, everyday sort of a part of your life. And that's the idea of a close relationship. This is a good friend. You can talk with them, they know you and things like that, but it's certainly not the closest. Now, an intimate relationship at the bottom of the point of the funnel, this is the idea that we have a close relationship that includes some kind of sexual passion that could be expressed and shared. So an intimate relationship goes further than just a close friend. This could be something like a partner, a boyfriend, girlfriend, a fiance, a husband, wife. This is something where you've definitely moved beyond the quote, just a friend stage, and you've moved into something else where there's a sexual spark and perhaps an intimacy. Now, the idea here that this could be expressed or shared. I am sure that in life you will come across people that you might have an attraction to, you're interested in, you have a mutual spark, but for one reason or another, you may not pursue that spark. It might not be appropriate to do so. The situation might be where one or the other of you is married, or it's a work relationship. So I think navigating some of these more difficult situations where you do feel that sort of romantic spark, if you were, but how do you navigate that when one or the other is in sort of a touchy, do not cross this line situation? So let's take a look and think about now a little bit more about intimate relationships. Not all intimate relationships are the same. In other words, there are differences across relationships that you might think about. The idea, first of all, that relationships are different in terms of how they started. For example, might you think that a relationship formed over the internet over some period of time where people hadn't really seen one another might be different than the relationship formed in a bar where people are drinking, and maybe it's a club or a lounge or something, and they meet in person and see one another and exchange numbers? Might those two situations be different? Or might it be different if you are in that bar or lounge and met somebody and got their number versus being involved in a set up arranged marriage that your parents arranged? Now, we have a professor at Cal State LA, I've discussed this with her before, who is in an arranged marriage. Now, she happened to win the lottery of arranged marriages. Her husband is very attractive, very nice, very smart, and they're a darling couple. So in that instance, I think it worked out pretty great. Other instances I've heard of situations where it didn't work out so great. So the idea of how did this relationship start? I know of another wonderful couple that I adore. He was the student body president of USC. He married this darling girl. Well, they were high school sweethearts, and they've been married now 10 years, and just a darling couple. And they're sort of, growing up together. They were very young when they started dating, and now they're young men and women starting their career and things like that. So just doing fine. But that's a different way to meet someone in school and date them all those years and get married. Is a more traditional way to approach an intimate relationship, and probably one that we don't see as much these days as we used to see. The second piece of this here is the type of love that people have for one another. Is it a passionate love, or is it more of a companionate love? You might think of some of these relationships, maybe a newlywed couple. They have a lot of passion, they have a lot of sexual spark, sexual activity, but maybe this couple 50 years in, maybe that isn't what is the driving force of that relationship anymore. Maybe it's more of a companionship, a friendship, a knowing of one another after all these years that keeps them together. That's the glue that keeps them together, that more of that companionate, the intimacy, the lifestyle, things of that nature, as opposed to maybe that strong sexual bond that they might have had early on in the relationship. So the idea that the type of love that people have for one another may be different. So think about that idea. So why do we want to look at intimate relationships anyway? What is it about them that's so important? Why are they important? Well, first of all, intimate relationships matter to the people in them. I've known a few people who have lost their spouses at a young age or unexpectedly. Person got sick and died, and I spoke with one man not too long ago. He said he'd been married for, I think he said 34 years. His wife had gotten cancer and died about a year before. And I said to him, how you doing? How you getting along? And he says, well, some days better than other. And there was a wistfulness about him and a bit of a sadness about him. The idea that, you don't get over that right away. The person plays such a role in your life. There's a wonderful book by C.S. Lewis where he talks about he was a confirmed bachelor for so many years, and he met his wife named Joy, and she was just the love of his life and brought him such joy. And she suddenly developed cancer or something and died not too long after they were married. So it was as if, the rug had just been pulled out from under him. And he explores and talks about in this book on grief, the loss of this wife and how much she mattered, and that that the grief for her and the loss of her just is like the sky that arches over everything. So the idea that intimate relationships and your experience of them can influence or impact every other aspect of your life. That's why it's so important to be in a good relationship and not in one that's always turbulent or exhausting or unequal, unbalanced somehow, because it can have such a wide-ranging of impact, and they do matter. And we'll talk about that together during our time in the course. There are also, so we could think about the idea of psychological consequences and physical consequences of relationships. And we'll talk about that. But the idea that someone can bring you great joy, like the marriage of C.S. Lewis. I mean, he was absolutely full of joy to know this wife. And the idea that other people who may be insecure, who maybe having issues of their own, can beat you down, can make you feel anxious or depressed. And that's not a good relationship. But the idea that intimate relationships can kind of get under your skin in a bad way and cause, psychological consequences for you and possibly physical consequences. And there's a lot of research out there, by the way, that shows that people in relationships, particularly married relationships, get over physical ailments better, are less likely to die from them. I mean, there's a raft of research on this topic, and our popular culture tries to tell, especially young men, that being single is really the greatest thing. That's where you get your joy. But that is not what the research shows. That the player is not the guy who wins the game in the long run. In fact, there are many benefits, more benefits even for women than men, to being married. So that's something that we'll think about during this course. I know a lot of younger folks, millennials under about age 29 or so, have given up on the idea of getting married. They're cynical about it, but there's some very good reasons why you might want to rethink that. And the last part here is, the last two parts are sort of interlocking. The idea that why are intimate relationships important? Because they matter to the people around them and they matter to society. Some people get pushed or pressured by family to be married by a certain age, or to be married, period, or to have children to carry on the family lineage. Do you experience that kind of pressure in your family? The idea that someone wants you to get married, or why haven't you gotten married, or when are you getting married? I remember I was working on my doctorate, my dissertation. I was telling my grandmother about it, and she listened, and she said, well, why do you want to work that hard? And then later she said, well, that's fine, but who are you going to marry? So, I mean, to her, that was the end game, was getting married. She actually went to UC Berkeley and was going along to school studying home economics in the 1920s, which is a long time ago for women to be in a major college like that. And she quit. And I asked her, why did you quit? Well, she got her MRS degree. She married Carson, her husband. They were married till the day he died, and but she quit school. That's what she was looking for, was to meet a husband, and she did. So that idea, and also intimate relationships are important to employers. And we'll talk about that later. But if you're married, you're sending off a signal that you, one, can make a commitment, two, can keep a commitment, and three, that you're stable. And employers love this. So for men, again, especially, you're going to get a boost in probably income and also responsibility if you are married. Take a look at all these politicians we see. We always see them with a wife at their side, and that's very calculated. So in terms of psychological consequences, and I just want to touch on some of these ideas today, and we'll get into them in more detail as we go through our course, but in general, and let me give you a little caveat up front here. The idea that we're going to talk in terms of sociological patterns. That means that we look at surveys of large groups of people. Could be 1,000, it could be tens of thousands, or it could be, in fact, a census of our entire country and people's behaviors. But the idea that we are going to look for sociological patterns, that means that we're going to look at what the averages are of large groups of people. So when I give you these examples, you might say, well, I know somebody that's not like that, or I know somebody that's not married and they're happy. Of course you do, and so do I. But that's not the point of this. The point is not that there are not exceptions to these sociological and psychological rules. There are always exceptions. There are always what we call outliers, are those people that don't necessarily follow the trend. But in general, the things I'm going to talk to you about and talk with you about, these are psychological and sociological truths that are based on research facts developed, again, through surveys, through interviewing, through observation. And I'm also going to bring in some experiences I've had both through life and through the fact that I worked in a mental hospital for 2.5 years in a locked psych unit, assessing patients, many of them who had either drug or alcohol problems, or they had issues with, depression, anxiety, and suicide. Many of them were trying to kill themselves. And we'll talk about some of those issues and how they link back to relationships. So the key here now is to say that studies consistently show that people in intimate relationships are generally happier than people who are not in them. And the type of relationship matters. That's why people say, well, we're together, we're living together, or we're dating or something like that. So that's okay,
thinking about
but it's
some of the
not a
psychological
marriage. It
consequences of
doesn't
being
bring
in
the
a
same level
relationship.
of
One of the
happiness
things that we
that
might
a
think
marriage
about is
brings.
this idea that
So
intimate
that's one thing to
relationships
think
can
about.
help
Higher
to
levels
put
of
people
happiness
at
are
ease.
especially likely to be found among married people.
There was a study
And
done a few years ago. And
secondly,
it
and this
turns out
makes
that when
perfect sense
faced
to
with a
you, I'm
possible
sure,
shock,
that higher levels
people
of
who were able to
happiness
hold
are
hands with their
especially
partner
likely to be
and were
found
happy
among
in their
people
relationship
in
were
happy
calmer.
relationships.
And this is something that they
so,
set
I mean,
up
that
in-
just
in
sort
a
of goes without
psychological
saying.
round.
But you
But
would
the
think
idea
that
that
out,
holding hands
So
can be
again,
calming
these
to
are
people
statistical
holds true.
generalities about
And
how
here is a slide which
people
shows this hand-holding
perceive their
study that
own
we're
lives.
talking about.
But
So
when you
in the
ask
first
thousands
box,
or tens
you
of thousands
can
of
see
people,
that there's
this
no
is what the
hand-holding,
patterns
and it's
are.
low
These
to
are the
high,
patterns that emerge.
anxiety and stress, really.
And it's then you look at the spouse hand, and that low to high, that stress goes down. So no hand, you can see to the right, the stress level goes up. On the middle spouse's hand, the stress goes down to the right. And the dots are where the different scores fell, by the way, those green dots. And lastly, a stranger's hand did not have the same effect. You can see that the stress goes up. So it's not just holding a hand, it's holding a loved one's, and in this case, a spouse's hand, that reduced the stress. So one thing that you want to think about this idea is that really holding hands and having someone to go through life with, through the stresses of life, helps you to handle the stresses of life. And I think that's really an important thing to think about. Having a partner can help you get through life. Now, there's other physical consequences that you might think about in terms of the impacts of having an intimate relationship in your life. One of these is that interaction with an intimate relationship partner releases oxytocin. Oxytocin is related to both feelings of calmness and trust, but it's also considered a bonding hormone. This same oxytocin is released when women are breastfeeding. It's a way that nature set up for people to bond together. So women in particular release oxytocin when they're around or they're having physical encounters with their loved ones. So, think about that. What might be some of the consequences of the fact that women are more likely to release this bonding hormone, oxytocin, than men are
when in intimate relationships and physical relationships. Another physical consequence of being in an intimate relationship is that people who are in happier intimate relationships actually generally live longer. There are many studies on this type of topic, not only that they're living longer, but if they are faced with some kind of cancer or other disease, that people in intimate relationships, committed marital relationships in particular, are more likely to overcome these physical challenges. Here's a study by Coyne and colleagues in 2001 that showed that people coping with congenital heart failure but were in more satisfying relationships were more likely to be alive when researchers followed up with them 4 years later. So it's really significant, I think, this idea that having a happy intimate relationship can impact your actual physical health and longevity. In this heart failure study, in the 48 months following a spouse's heart attack, about 30% of the patients in happy relationships died, compared to 55% of the patients in unhappy relationships. So this is another from Coyne and their colleagues, a 2001 study called The Prognostic Importance of Marital Quality for Survival of Congestive Heart Failure. And this was published in the American Journal of Cardiology. Pretty significant if it's going to help you stay alive to have an intimate relationship, don't you think? So here's the bottom line, or lines, in terms of intimate relationships. One is that generally most people want an intimate relationship. Second of all, those who have a good intimate relationship tend to be happier than those that don't. And lastly, those that have them tend to also be healthier than those that don't. Now, could it be that there are selection effects going on? This idea that it could be that people are happier and healthier to begin with are more attractive to potential relationship partners. Well, that could be the fact. It's called a selection effect. However, this accounts for some, but not all of these findings. So overall, when we take a look at it, it's the idea that intimate relationships offer protection effects against disease and against early dying, actually. So let's take a look at another factor that's related to intimate relationships, and that is children. So think about this idea. Have you come from a family where there's been divorce, or have you known some of your friends that have had parental divorces? So kind of think about that, and the idea of, maintaining one household as opposed to the cost of maintaining two households when you have a relationship that's broken apart and when there's children involved. The other factor is, so let's take a look at a couple of things. Parental marriage is related to lower levels of poverty. You often now have over 65% of households where they're married, both partners are working and bringing in an income now. It's a minority of households where the wife is a full-time stay-at-home mother. So you have lower levels of poverty in these households. You also typically, in marital relationships, you have higher levels of education. There are fewer emotional problems and fewer behavioral problems for children in households that are what researchers call intact. So something to think about when weighing out the idea of even getting a divorce. So think about this now, this idea that marital status, it's not just about marital status, but the satisfaction in that relationship. So what is that related to? Well, if you're satisfied in your relationship, it's related to more emotional security. There's fewer emotional problems, fewer behavioral problems, and greater physical health. And this relates to the children as well. So this idea that if you have a stable parent dyad and children are involved, that they're going to be happier and healthier as a result. Children often take the signal from the parents in terms of the stress or the calmness. So it's very, very important that parents work on their own emotional issues when they have children in the home. So when we think about now the idea of divorce, the ending of a marriage, is this good or bad? Well, part of this relates to the quality of the parents' relationship before the divorce. The idea that if there's a highly conflictual marriage, there's a lot of fighting all the time, it actually can lead to positive outcomes for children. Not being in a high conflict environment is way less stressful and way healthier for children than one where there's just constant fighting going on. The end of a less conflictual marriage, however, is related to more negative outcomes for children. So one thing we want to think about, and psychologists talk about this phrase a lot, and counselors, marriage and family therapy counselors talk about the idea of intergenerational transmission of these different patterns and mental health issues. So the idea is that there is evidence that there is intergenerational transmission related to divorce in terms of the children's later relationship patterns. So basically, parents are setting the template for children's expectations of later relationships. Children with divorced parents are more likely to have their marriages end in divorce. And children with parents in unhappy marriages are more likely themselves to have unhappy marriages. So the idea that we have this intergenerational transmission, does that mean you're doomed if your parents had a bad relationship or they were divorced? Well, intergenerational transmission does not translate to destiny. It turns out that children of divorced parents are about 10 to 20% more likely to divorce later. They're not 100% more likely to divorce. So I think a lot of people nowadays, a lot of millennials in particular, are putting off marriage. And many of them, when you ask why, they say, well, my parents were divorced. I don't want to go through that. But it turns out that it's not 100% chance that they're likely to divorce. So when you think about the bottom line for children and what that is, parents' marital status and parents' relationship satisfaction are both related to the outcomes for their children, and that these outcomes, it can extend into adulthood. So again, it's very important for parents to work on their marriage, to deal with issues and things like that, because they are acting as models for their children, which those models will later be carried into the adulthood of those children. So the other idea now is that, are there consequences for people other than the partners in society? Social control theory says that intimate relationships increase the negative consequences of deviant behavior. So think about this idea, that people in intimate, committed relationships are less likely to misuse alcohol and drugs, and that intimate relationships help to regulate behavior. So, you think about it. Would you stay in a relationship, a married relationship, if your partner's using a lot of drugs or drinking a lot, things like that? So you want to kind of think about that idea that, that intimate relationships help people to not be drinking or doing tons of drugs. A lot of the times the reason why people are doing that is because they're self-medicating. They're self-medicating because they're anxious, they're depressed, and relationships help to lower those kinds of negative emotional experiences. So that's why people that are single are more likely to be doing these kinds of things. So let's take a look here at this. This is about intimate relationships and adherence to social norms. But this chart looks at the percentage using cocaine in the last month, and then at baseline, which is the first mark on the bottom, and the second one is 2 years later. So if you take a look at each one of these that went from divorced to married, that's the black line, it just plummets. So, by the way, cocaine is related to areas in the brain that boost kind of upbeat feelings, but also boost self-esteem. So people who are doing cocaine are dealing with issues of self-esteem largely. So this idea that people that are married, they feel good about themselves as it is, and so they're less likely to be doing that. You can see also single to engaged are less likely to be doing it, engaged to be married. So this idea that even the promise of being married lowers the use of cocaine here. But look at the one that goes up, married to divorce, that light gray line in the middle. That shows 2 years later, after the divorce, they're more likely to be doing drugs. So the bottom line is that intimate relationships are associated with outcomes that matter to the partners in the relationship, to their children, and to society. So committed intimate relationships have a myriad of positive benefits for all three of these layers. So what do we want to know about intimate relationships when we think about that? A couple things that we want to think about. Why do some relationships remain stable and satisfying? What is it that keeps them stable? And the second question would be then, what makes some relationships unstable or unsatisfying? Some of the work I did with eHarmony, I worked as a consultant for them for quite a while. We've published some papers together and done research together. So I'll talk to you about some of the qualities that they're looking at to match people up to increase happiness and increase marital stability. So I definitely have some firsthand knowledge of this kind of work and research. So let's think about relationship satisfaction. That's something that we're going to really be focusing on together during the course. And one question you might want to ask yourself is, happy compared to what? There's this idea of his marriage and her marriage, or the idea that people have different perspectives on the same intimate relationship, and that these perspectives might change. So you kind of want to think about this. She's rating in this cartoon him at a 2.5, and he's rating it at a 4. So, you kind of think about what relationship satisfaction means. So let's chat about that in our discussion. Thanks for being in class. Really appreciate it. And I look forward to your ideas about relationships and all these kinds of topics. And feel free, again, if you have thoughts or ideas, to bring them into our chat room. So go ahead over to the chat forum and I'll post some questions. Looking forward to chatting with you about these things in that area. Thanks again. Bye-bye.